before I get into questioning Chris, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about him. If you don't know about him, he's so super, present on social media, and he's written some wonderful articles for TheatreArtLife, so you can read a lot about him. But he's the managing director of Pioneer Theatre Company, which is a LORT institution that serves as the official state theatre of Utah, under the auspicious University of Utah, at which Chris jointly serves as senior administrator. In the private sector, Chris is the founder and managing member of Imagine Tomorrow, an international firm spanning hundreds of partners, founded to shepherd and source capital for creative works in entertainment, lifestyle, and tech. Its mission is to develop impactful creative projects that inspire humanity to do good. He is an award-winning producer of theatre, film, television, video games, and music, a two-time Tony Award nominee, business development consultant, and leading art activist, recently a new father. We don't know how he fits this all into his day, but we're going to find that out. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Anne. It's a very kind introduction. Thank you very much.
So we'll start with Pioneer Theatre Company, right? So you're the managing director. So tell us about your journey to this role and why Pioneer Theatre Company.
Sure. So theater's kind of always been part of my life. We'll backtrack to the beginning of little 5-year-old, 6-year-old Christopher, right, who saw his first production of any show, and it was Oliver. And I thought, oh, wow, I want to be part of this. And Oliver, who played Oliver, waved to me, and I waved to him. He thought I was actually his friend, and I wasn't, although we became friends. And eventually, from a conversation we had backstage after that, and I said, what is this? He's like, this is theater. And I was like, I want to do this. And my parents were like, no, that's probably not a good idea. But basically, I've had a thing throughout my life where people have said, you can't do this. And I'll say, oh, yeah, I'll show you. And I go forward and I do it. So that was the start of theater kind of for me in my life is I started as a childhood actor, right? And I guess I had some talent. Like back in that day, you didn't have to be a triple threat to actually be on Broadway. You just had to be like decent and a child. So I was in a couple of shows like that. I was in Les Mis. I was Tommy and Tommy. I was a Chip in Beauty and the Beast. And through these journeys, I actually came across my mentor, Hal Prince, because I had seen Phantom of the Opera as a young kid. And I had said, who's the person behind this? Through the help of some relatives and such, I was able to find out who it was. Hal took me into his office, and that became the start of what was a 25-year relationship up until the point that Hal passed and left us. But during that process, I basically wanted to be a producer. At some point earlier in my life, I actually wanted to be a scientist, but that changed. Again, that had to do with Hal basically saying, well, what are you doing? You should be a producer if you want to be a producer. And that's kind of been a trajectory I followed for years. And as I did that, it spanned out into different categories and different formats, whether it was in television or film or video games or advertising. And it's kind of been the motif of my life and what I like doing. And why I like doing that is because ultimately, what a producer does is create, right? Now, where they create and how they create depends on what the organization is, what the project is, and what the needs are for that, right? So you're kind of the adaptable person who ultimately has to see the job through, right? You can do that sometimes on your own. You sometimes do that in a partnership, which is what we have here at Pioneer Theater, which is great. I'm a little more in the nuts and bolts. Karen Eisenberg, my wonderful artistic director, who's brilliant and a visionary, is more on the artistic end, but there's a good complement between the two of us. And we trust each other, and that's an important part of it. So fast forward through, some producing. I was on American Idiot. I was in all the general management offices you could imagine, learning as much as I could about the nuts and bolts and also the fundraising and also the marketing and the development and all those things. And eventually I left theater to be an independent consultant because theater is obviously a very, very intense industry. I think our industry, more than others, we almost like wear this badge of pride of how much we work and put into it. But it can be exhausting. Yeah, it can be burnout. And I was kind of at that point. So I was on my own, and 3 people from one organization basically said, you need to come here. They need a marketing consultant. And that ended up being the National Yiddish Theater. And of course, only like a year later after that, I was suckered back into it, and I was CEO. And I did that for 7 years. And that was really cool because that's like the country's oldest consecutively producing. I think they're now saying Yiddish theater. In my tenure, it was theater, period, because it was the longest consecutively producing theater that hadn't actually stopped at any point. So that was very cool. I did that. We were able to get Broadway back on the stage by partnering through Indecent, Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish was kind of my swan song. And at that point, I kind of accomplished everything I set out to do, right? You come into these jobs and, whether you're vocal about it or you have to be vocal about it, but you choose what to be vocal about it. For instance, now in the pandemic, I haven't been completely vocal about what the plan is because it changed halfway through my tenure. But yeah, you have goals, right? And I've been a big believer that once you accomplish those, and the vision is met and you've done your part, you're only going to cause harm by staying. And it's time to pass on the torch and go kind of wherever you're going to go next. So as I was doing that and we were finishing the negotiations on transferring our production of Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, which was universally acclaimed, directed by Joel Grey, kind of gave Yiddish, again, a big presence, right, in the world, and kind of tied in why that language tied into community and culture and how it's still very resonant. At that time, I was working with Manny Eisenberg, who is a friend and mentor. He's also Karen, my partner's here, father. So at some point, because Manny has more Tonys than I do years, I think. We were at lunch one day and we were just about wrapping the deal, and we were to go back to the negotiating after. And he said to me, because I think he knew that it was time for me. He said, Utah is beautiful this time of year. And they've got mountains, Chris. Oh, you're going to love the mountains. Think about it. It could be a quality life. And they said, huh. So, of course, from that, I found out that Pioneer Theater was looking for a managing director. And obviously, knowing the apple didn't fall very far from the tree at all with Karen, it seemed like it was the right move. And I came here, I interviewed, they courted me, and it's just, aside from being a really wondrous and beautiful place, and sometimes we get so stuck in the day-to-day that we don't take the time to lift our heads up. I mean, there are mountains everywhere. It's gorgeous. It's breathtaking, and it kind of recenters me like, oh, well, this thing might be happening in the day, but okay, we're here now, and I'm in the moment, and that's where I need to be. So basically, I was being courted, met the staff. It was a great staff. They had like we have a scenic and costume shop that's like phenomenal. It's incredible what they've been able to do on what many theaters our size would call like a shoestring budget, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that's a testament to this incredible, hardworking, dedicated staff. It's a testament to Karen and her leadership. And yeah, I was hooked. It was easy for me, and it was a little harder for my wife, who was running a buildings and inspection company in New York. And she had just started like a year ago. She's like, well, I know that you're done with the Yiddish theater, but I had just started my company, and we had that negotiation. I'm very grateful to my wife to having supported this decision for us to just kind of pick up and move across the country, because here was an opportunity to help build on an already awesome legacy with a great partner and a really great staff. So it was kind of a no-brainer for me. And
that's amazing.
As I say that, sorry, the phone goes off.
People are trying to get to you already.
I apologize. How rude. Here we are in the middle of this interview, and my phone's going off.
It's all good. It's all good. So explain for the people who are overseas what a LORT institution is and how that works in the USA.
Sure. So basically, LORT stands for League of Regional Theaters. Basically, it means it's a specific level of professional theater, right? And there's a distinction. There's professional theater, there's semi-professional theater, and there's community theater, right? We'll start with community theater. Community theater basically is amateur or for love of, right? So that is kind of there for the hobbyists to pursue and for people to kind of get what I would say an entryway into what theater can be, right? Mm-hmm. So that is a non-commercial, typically non-commercial. Some these days actually have been commercialized, but an area for people to kind of get a start in the theater. But make no mistake, the people who do this are doing this as side gigs, right? Or side hobbies, right? Then there's semi-professional, which is kind of like taking the community theater model and then allowing for guest professional contracts, right? Usually it's a stipend or an honorarium kind of deal where benefits really aren't being paid in and it's not livable wages. But it is an opportunity for people who are starting, who may not be in professional unions yet, to kind of get a grasp of what it could be, investing your time and your career into building towards, this as what you do. Then there's the professional theaters, right? And what most of them do, what we certainly do, and what is important is ensuring that those are livable wages and that these are actually people's livelihoods, right? So within the category of professional theaters, there are a number, right? There's the League of Regional Theaters that we talked about, but there are hundreds actually of different contracts, some of which fall into different categories, whether they're cabarets, right? Whether they're smaller, it's an LOA contract. I forgot which one that's called, but it's like a smaller regional kind of contract, and there are hundreds. And there are some that are specifically designed for theaters in particular. When I was in the National Yiddish Theater, one of the things I negotiated was a National Yiddish Theater contract, because we also were a foreign language producing company, and we had some differences and distinctions between us and some of those other contracts. So it only made sense for us to have our own kind of rule book. But here, as a League of Regional Theater, you fall into several categories, starting like with an A, which is the biggest, and have the usually the largest seating capacity, but also what's a big factor into that is revenue, right? So that goes from A, B, C, and D essentially. And then in between that, there's what's called like an A+, which is a super LORT. That's like the Roundabout Theater Award, right? I think Lincoln Center might be on that, but Lincoln Center might be on its own contract now. Not sure. I can ask Adam after this, and he'll let me know. But one goes down, and we're a LORT B, right? So we're a very big theater. We're 932 seats, and we operate in a budget of approximately 6 million, 5 to 6 million, with a true budget, if you include endowments and things like that, of about $12 million a year. So one of our responsibilities as a LORT theater is to ensure that we are working tandem with all of the professional unions, right? That's another distinction between being in a LORT theater or professional theater and not a professional theater, is we work with the stage directors and choreographer society, right? We work with USA, 829, right, which is the union for designers, right? We work with equity. Like, we have all of these unions that we work with, because if you are a professional theater, your actors are professionally represented and unionized. And part of that, and it's a good part of checks and balances, right, is we have our responsibilities to production and our actors and our designers, et cetera, but so do these unions. So it's a game of making sure that we are taking care of them, but it's falling into compliance, but also there are concessions when necessary, so that we can operate sustainably. And I think on our end, especially because Karen and I have had very long-standing relationships. In fact, Karen is a past, I believe she was the executive president of their board for SDC, which is the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society. And I've always been a fan of collaborating people to get a good result in the end. Is our negotiations are typically non-negotiation like, and they're more like conversations, because everybody wants the same thing. I mean, that even goes into one of the things that we've done in this pandemic time is I was surprised about this, and I thought there'd be more of us, and I hope there are more who I just don't know about. But when it hit the U.S., basically, and Karen and I had been talking about this like December before like it even came to the country, which is, what if this becomes an eventuality? When we knew that it was going to be very real and imminent, we had a very easy discussion between the two of us is, well, how are we going to make this right for the people who work with us? What does that mean? That means the people who are on staff, that means the people who work in our shops, that means the actors and artists who work with us. What can we do? And that kind of became our first and foremost priority is you take care of the foundation, right? The foundation is not structural in this case. It's the people. The people make the shows. The people are capital, but human capital also needs to be compensated, right? So how do we ensure we're doing that where we're not cutting salaries? How are we doing that where we're making sure people are staying on, or if we have to furlough, we're furloughing when there's actually a financial benefit for them to do that, which would be greater than their current salary, and then we bring them back on, right? To us, it wasn't an option. It was just a thing to do. And
so you laid out that plan in December. Really?
We started the
December,
conversation
January.
in December. We conceptually talked about what we would do in February. By March, we came up with part of the plan. By June, we started to bring back people, and why we had decided at a point to put the majority of our costume and scenic shop on furlough. But part of that reason also was because the financial benefit was being on that with the extra money that was coming in.
Right.
But it was always kind of working on how we can get people back. And Karen and I did this both separately and together, right? Like Karen came up with the work alternatives. I looked at the economics, and we came together like with the financial responsibility to make sure that we were doing right by the budget as we were making sure we did right by our people. And since January, basically everyone's been offered return to work. Everyone's been back, and it's been great. Now, I'd love to say that, you know, we came up with this and did it all on our own, right? But it's like, first of all, we're not about the credit like that. And second of all, there was some help, right? There was government help. There were a little bit of grants that normally weren't gotten. But frankly, and Karen and I talked about this before I came on, just, you know, because I want to just make sure we're telling the story exactly as is. And the reality is, if we didn't even find those grants or that support, we would have found a way, because the right thing to do, period, you know. And that's part of my love of having a partner in Karen, is she understands that people are our greatest resource, and those relationships are what will build a successful future. So that's that. I know that was a little bit of a long deviation out of how I got into Pioneer, but I figured since half of my tenure in Pioneer has been in the pandemic.
No, I think it's really interesting because the leadership is such an important aspect of you know, managing a company, and I think it's really through those times of crises that you see what are the core values held by that leadership, and that can be inspiring, or can be, if the people isn't at the center of that focus, then people feel that, right? So if that's been the start of your mindset in terms of managing through the pandemic, and also communication to explain, okay, this is our plan, this is us doing the best we can, and people understand that, then that's a great way to ride it out, right? Ride out the pandemic with that ethos.
I mean, well, that's right. We wanted to be as transparent as we could, but we also didn't want to share partly baked out information, right? Because we knew sometimes, especially in a time like this, if you come up with part of a plan, that's almost worse than coming up with a whole plan. So it's like, you know, a little bit of extra stress in the interim, but you have to have that to avoid any big blowouts of stress. And so, you know, as we quietly kind of worked on solutions, you know, Karen had a great idea that she was talking with her shop heads about, okay, so we do production. Essentially now we turn into production factories. We did all this fabric. We started to make masks. We have, I can't tell you how many storage facilities we have, but so many stuff from like 60 years now, because we're 60 years old, right? How can we repurpose it? That's what that was the idea that came out of this. And then as we did that, you know, I looked at economics carefully with Karen. We made sure that what we were doing essentially would be cost neutral, right? So it's like we're a nonprofit to begin with, but we weren't here to make a profit anyway. We just wanted to make sure if so-and-so is being brought back to work, do we think we're going to be able to sell that much in product to keep them on? Absolutely. So that was our mindset. And then also it was about staying relevant, right? What can we do in the time being? So we did some virtual programming. We partnered with some of our fellow institutions around here. We did some stuff with one of our affiliates called Red Butte Garden for their Halloween program. We really kind of kept our focus on our people and the community. I think that was important, not only because it helped us reach them in a different way, but it kind of gave credibility that, we're here as the State Theater of Utah. Like, that's our responsibility. It's us to have those relationships. I mean, Karen, Diane, who's our development director, Meryl, who's our individual giving manager, we call people. I call people every week. I have a quota of how many patrons I call just to say hi. I mean, it's a time for us to get to know people in a very real, different way. I mean, Karen is dropping off face masks and stuff, and we are having such connections that we may have not other had. So we're kind of, it's terrible to say there's an opportunity and where we are with COVID, but there was, because it gave us an opportunity to kind of stop the rat race of what normally happens and reevaluate who we are. And like you said, what are those defining values? And maybe we haven't yet articulated that fully on a sheet, but we understand that as a theater, we're going to hold ourselves accountable to the people who are here. And that's a big deal. And I think that's a way to grow.
Well, actions speak louder than what's written on a piece of paper anyway, right? So, right. Excellent. So you have a video too. Can you want to introduce how that plays into what you and Pioneer are doing?
Yeah. So we've, as I said, we've been trying to stay relevant and rethink who we are and what we're doing in the community. So one of the first things I did when I was brought on, because I was brought on a little bit, to bring in a little more brand cohesion, right? Pioneer, like many theaters, this is not atypical, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have X amount of budget and you kind of focus on your shows independently. Well, independent shows are great if you're commercial, but if you're a nonprofit theater, if you're a regional theater, right, it should be about the institution and what it means to be part of that institution and who are the people behind that institution. So through staff surveying, through board analysis, through patron surveying, we came up with a strategy of what our brand would look like. And that was your ticket to feel. And this season, of course, with all the things going on with the world and us coming back, it's going to be your ticket to feel good. So this kind of does something that's really important. I think it doesn't matter what sector you really are in, but especially for theater, which is it humanizes it and it lets people understand not only what we or parts of what we've been doing in vignettes during this pandemic, but why we do it and who we are and what we stand for. So I think that's as good of a setup as I can think of.
That's amazing. All right. So while I get this started, if you just turn off your microphone and we'll play it for our guests here. I'm ready. Let's go.
Every time you go to the theater is going to be a different experience because of the theater you're seeing. But what you're going for is that feeling. I'm going to feel happy. I'm going to feel sad. I'm going to laugh. I'm going to cry. I'm going to think. That ticket to feel is what draws me back to the theater every time.
I love to tell stories. Everything that we do becomes a story to create a character.
We furloughed everybody, and it was scary. I didn't have any answers.
We were fully employed until mid-March, like everyone else, and we went home. And I was lucky enough that Karen and Reed brought me back in early August. And at that point, we were just getting started on this second act products and thinking about what do we have in the building? What do we have in our stock that we can use? What can we recycle? What's cool? What's going to be fun? That was the beginning, I think, for us.
Second act came around from a different angle. We had to move all of our scenic storage, which is a tremendous amount of stuff. But because we were in the pandemic, it was complicated. But I said, before you throw anything away, let's determine if there's any way we can sell it. So we started second act with a smaller number of items that we could make literally from stuff we had, so that we were not spending any money on supplies and repurposing them and making a profit to, again, help subsidize people coming back to work. So we cleaned out our storage, we repurposed a whole bunch of stuff, and we've been making some money.
It's gratifying. It feels good. We're a culture of people who work and are used to finishing our days and being tired. And how do you fulfill yourself creatively and expend some energy when you're stuck in 1,300 square feet. So coming back feels really good.
From a production of Guys and Dolls that we had done 25 years ago. We also had fabric and decking from The Play That Goes Wrong, and fabric from Christmas at Pemberley, and metal from Sweeney Todd.
Working in theater, that's what we do. We create and we tell stories, and that's what feeds us moving forward.
So yeah, that would be, that's going to be something we're going to launch in a day or two, and we're going to have a series of vignettes that kind of will be narrated between Karen and myself, and kind of tell everyone's story about the people who work here and, you know, why they do what they're doing. So
that's amazing, because, you know, it's that connection and empathy with what people are going through that's going to bring people back, right? So it's a great foothold to bring people back to the theatre. What an amazing story. It's quite moving.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's go back. Let's shift a little bit to you as a person. You've worked across multiple genres of entertainment. And what's your core skill set? What would you describe that to be? And how did you develop this? So, you know, how did you develop your producing skills? And then how does that shift to being a managing director, et cetera?
Well, I think, and this is silly and maybe it's a play on words, but being a managing director is really about managing expectations, right? And how does that work is understanding which relationships to build, how to foster those, what areas they need to be augmented, and understanding the players involved. Now, that being said, especially in this new position for me, right, it's changed. My predecessor did a great job. He was here 30 years almost, right? So there's a new guy, right? There's also a fundamental shift in what my job description is comparatively, right? He was much more in the financial area, and it's not that I'm not. I'm actually extremely in the financial area right now, yeah, so that's changed because there's been a little more focus on, for my end, for like marketing, development, fundraising, visibility, profile stuff, all of that great stuff, and also working within the university to see what kind of synergies are here and seeing what kind of outreach we can do within the community to kind of expand our diversity and inclusion efforts, as well as just making sure we're serving the community and that it's being represented here at Pioneer. But then, of course, compounded on top of that, right, is COVID. Right. Mm-hmm. So halfway through, you know, my tenure, the new rule book that we were coming out with had changed. Right now, we're in an entirely new rule book, and we're thinking about what the rule book moving forward is going to be. So, of course, that management of expectations has been quite difficult. But I think you just keep sticking at it and showing you're genuine and authentic, and that you're there and you're going to listen, and not just listen to listen, but you're going to hear. You're going to try to say yes and make things happen to people when you can, but you also have to know how to say no for the time being, right? So I think it's part of it is expectations management, right? Within that, it's relationship building. And then when you take that a step further, it's about creating enough camaraderie within those relationships that you create enough champions who will help you move the ship forward together. So like something I did with even the last position I was in, right, is it got to a point, and believe me, I didn't slack at all, but where I wouldn't have to be there. I had basically, the department heads were so good at what they were doing, and they were so ready for taking the next step and owning the initiatives that I felt good going, you know. And we're getting to a point very quickly here, right? We have people who are so incredibly skilled, but one of the challenges, one of the challenges is adjusting that model. And what might have worked for X amount of years may not be working right now. So I think as people start to think about that, they're understanding where they need to move forward. And I think we're doing a good job with that as a company. Now, that being said, there's a lot we still need to do to ensure that we're ready for growth, right? I would say we are very sustainable. We have changed our model a little bit. So when I came in, basically the fundraising percentage was about 40% contributed and about 60% earned, which is like amazing, right? That you're actually, as a nonprofit regional theater, banking 60%. On your show.
Wow.
60%. Well, but we had to change that, right? or at least start to change that. So we like doubled our individual giving within a year. We sustained corporate. We're going to be planning on really building on corporate. Foundation's kind of been leveled, but the foundation is kind of finite and limited depending where you're going anyway, unless it's project based. So we were able to really kind of already kind of change those dynamics of how our fundraising worked. But, you know, as we do that, we want to ensure that we're poised to grow next, right? So now we're looking at sustainability, right? And ensuring that we're going to be okay coming into the next year after the pandemic. But I think, honestly, we've showed that we are good financial stewards of that. The year of the pandemic, our fiscal year ends in June. We were looking at a $1.4 million loss. We ended up losing only about a true deficit of $66,000.
Wow.
So we've been able to really kind of be smart where cuts need to be made, but also be smart enough to understand that resources need to be allowed during that time. This year, believe it or not, we're going to break even. So it's where there's a will, there's a way, but we are working very hard at not only proving that we will be sustainable in the future as we move forward, but that there's growth potential, because part of the name of the game now, and this is not typical, or this is atypical to most regional theaters anyhow, is usually because you're in a pattern of going and going and going and going, you're missing some of your foundational building blocks. And this time I am talking about structural stuff. So we're now addressing things that maybe haven't been fixed since the 60s that, you know, if we're not fixing it today, that's a hazard tomorrow. So so it's about sustainability in that front, making sure that the theater is going to be able to operate as we come into the new world, and then see what kind of growth potential there might be.
No, super interesting. I'm interested to know, and also because it's been a discussion a lot in the last year when we talk with some people early parts of their career, that during their education process, be that in university or coming into the industry without a formal education path, is that there seems to be a little bit of lack of the business acumen of the skill set, right? And so you're very clearly heavily in that business leadership and all of that as part of the arts. And how do you see that balance? And also, how did you cultivate that business acumen? Was it by being around the right people? And how did you build your confidence in that? Because I feel like a lot of people discover that by default or when they're put in those positions. But it seems to be you have a very clear vision, and you've gone out to act, especially to survive through the pandemic, you've gone out to actively pursue sustainability from a business perspective, which is not necessarily a natural skill set for people who are, you know, like to make shows, you know. So tell me about that.
Right. Sure. So that was actually a happy accident when I was in high school. So I was kind of at the point where I wasn't really performing professionally anymore, but I was interning at a regional theater, and this was in Bound Brook, New Jersey. It was called the Brook Arts Center, which had just been flooded because it was right next to a river, and that river kept flooding, and it kept flooding the theater, and I don't think the theater's there anymore.
Oh my gosh, that's so random.
But essentially, at one point I'd said so I was my senior class president in high school, and these were like the wonderful days where you would put money in like water jugs instead of going to the bank, and somebody took those water jugs one day, and that went, all our money was gone. And of course, as the president, it's like, what are you going to do to solve it? I'm like, great. So I talked with Jerry Apple, who was the executive producer of the Brook Arts Center then, and kind of gave him the 2-minute speech of why I need his help to do something. And he said, okay, well, pitch me a show. And I did. And it ended up being the Rocky Horror show. And why it's relevant was the Brook Arts Center was like one of the first midnight Rocky Horror theaters in the country, right? Before it was an actual arts venue, it was a movie cinema house. So I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, okay, so I want to do that because I think that sounds like a good PR angle, and we need to make a lot of money to replace the money that had been stolen. So, okay, let's try this. And before I knew it, you know, it had just come off Broadway. I was talking with Jordan Roth, who runs Jew Gems in theaters, who since has been a mentor, role model friend, and Samuel French about licensing and rights. And before I knew it, it ended up being a hodgepodge of amateurs and also people under professional contracts. So here I was, I don't think I was even 18 at that point. I think I was 17 years old, and producing really, a professional theater production. And boy, was that interesting. But I am the kind of person that when I get into something, for good or worse, I'm kind of like in the zone. And this will happen. Like even if I'm working on a project and it's 6 a.m. On a Saturday, my wife might be like, "Hey, are you going to move?" I'm like, "Yeah, I just started." And she'll say, "Oh, it's 4 p.m." So it's like what we ended up doing with that production is we ended up with such a good marketing angle, with such a good charity angle, that the production ended up selling out, and we didn't have to raise any more money for my senior class for the rest of the year. And that was before I went into NYU, which was where I got my undergraduate and master's. And essentially, I was poised to become a genetic engineer, right? And instead, I saw Fiddler on the Roof, which ties into Fiddler later on in my life. And of course, Hal Prince was the original producer on that. And I called Hal and I had like a quarter life crisis. Like, what do I do? And that's when he said, "Well, if you want to be a theater producer, you should do that." And that's kind of the genesis of where all of that started. And from there, it's just been about, preparing. And what is it? Luck is when preparation meets opportunity, right? It's kind of been like that. So I had so many different experiences that led to different places. I mean, I took on an internship with a gaming company when I was in college. I ended up really proving I could be a central part of the team. They made me an assistant producer, which really is a glorified executive assistant term at that point. But I ended up really having an opportunity to present myself at the table. And what ended up happening is I ended up being promoted to the line producer. And that video game was a little known title called BIOSHOCK, which is one of the world's great franchises. So that led to me in that kind of world where I was like, oh, so I'm a theater producer and now I'm a film producer. That's interesting. And as I was working on different things with that, I met a lot of great people who worked in the music departments, right? Because a lot of these producers kind of stay at their desks, and I don't like doing that. I kind of do walk about around management, which to some people could be like bothersome, but also I like to know what's going on. And because of that, I eventually hooked up with Jason Mraz's people, and I ended up doing a lot of musical and brand development consulting. And one of the things I did for him was the brand strategy on radio. And I did that for his song, "I'm Yours," which at the time, because of the strategy, and it was a team effort, but I think it was 96 weeks. It stayed on the chart. It was the longest.
It was a massive song when it came out. Yeah, I remember that. All the way over in Australia, I was there listening to it.
Yeah, everything kind of tied together. Just the more I put myself out there, the more I realized the world of entertainment is not siloed and it's very bridged. So I kind of found my way through, like I even said, into the advertising world, right? Like just because people liked my sense of humor and they liked some of the stuff I was writing. And I also, as I got into video games, part of it is they said, wow, those are some good ideas. I know you're typically not nuts and bolts, but do you have any interest in being, somewhat involved in the creative process? I said, sure. So I ended up scripting some of those video games. And of course, that happened, advertising companies that work with these conglomerates took a shine to me, and I ended up doing some pretty phenomenal things with some different people. I worked with Old Spice, who's obviously brand of Procter & Gamble, and they were hemorrhaging at the time. And through my silly sense of humor, I devised the Sense for Gents commercial, which is kind of that ridiculous Old Spice brand that you have today. I put that into the world. So there's been a lot of interesting, fun things like that. I was over the pond for Intel's Museum of Me, which was kind of like a precursor combination of Ancestry.com combined with Instagram, which was a financial failure, but gave root to a lot of understanding of how you can capitalize on social media and to start trending things, right? And just making decisions in terms of advertising by customers. And we ended up actually, that was partnered with Facebook, and we ended up selling that to Facebook. So it wasn't a financial loss in the end. And it was like, I created the most interesting man in the world. So I did quite a few things with advertising over the years, and it kind of all feeds into each other. I got into film. I remember how I got into film, but at some point I got into that world.
But it's so amazing because, you know, I think that's definitely the philosophy of Theatre Art Life, that there is, like you said, that entertainment doesn't sit in silos, and there's so many connectivities between that. And I think, but actually also you working in all those different areas built business acumen for when you were back in the theatre, right? So that's quite fascinating. Exactly. Yeah. And I think one of the central sort of commonalities between those industries, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it's something that's quite pervasive in your descriptions about you and your ethos, is the importance of storytelling, right? And in all of those genres, you're doing some aspect, even in advertising, you're doing some aspect of storytelling, and that's where the creativity, which is maybe even what you were attracted to in the first place with Fiddler on the Roof, like the telling of the story. Would you say that's your common core on that?
I would. I think that it's storytelling, right, is the link to the next generation, right? So if a story is worth being told and it's captivating and it moves me in some way or another, I want to be involved. And that necessarily doesn't need to be on the creative end, right? I've been involved with many things where I've just been in the nuts and bolts of it, but you do have to understand your product, right? And you have to be able to connect, I think, with some level to your product. And I'm kind of at the point in my career in life where if I don't, and if suggestions aren't taking, that we can kind of bridge it more into a span or breadth of understanding of humanness, right? Then I'm not interested, because I feel like it's not serving the right purpose, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a ridiculous story. It doesn't mean if it's a didactic story. It doesn't really matter, as long as ultimately it's saying something that means something. And that's always kind of been something I had been passionate about. And I'm excited now that in my life and in my career that it's something that I have a choice in.
You get to work on daily, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's been the exciting thing is we talk about the business acumen, right? Like you said, across all the different spectrums, that's kind of how it gets. You build that because you learn different components of how different things fit in together. And you realize that you want to take some of those things that you learned from television and you want to bring them to theater, and you want to take some of those things that you might have learned from recorded music, and maybe that makes sense in musical theater, right? Because we look at things in such a different way that it's sometimes hard to realize there is a way to make them more cohesive by bringing the outside in, right? So as I kind of did that and I built with those things, I guess I realized that I'm trying to, I want to say this in you realize that there is more connectivity to these industries that necessarily they lead on, right? In some organizations we might have, it's, oh, well, they're in film, or, oh, they're in theater, or they're in music. And why that took me a second also is because I've kind of struggled to find a place, because I kind of live in all these worlds, and it's been hard for people to understand you can, and that's okay. I mean, even in this position, you know, as I do other things, right, that don't encroach on the time of this position, it's kind of like people don't understand that you can be more than one thing, and that's
yes.
I'm excited that I can choose at this point in my career, because I am more than one thing, and I'm happy to be.
Yeah, multifaceted, absolutely. And I mean, even just in the video that you show, it's interesting because you're not just telling the story of the theatre show you're doing, you're telling the story of the people, you're telling the story of the community, you're telling stories, you know, and that it's not just about, you know, promoting that show that's on stage. It's a bigger mission. And I think that's amazing. So can you weigh in a little bit, you know, because it's been hot topics and we are from my perspective on this side of the world looking in on the USA, and a lot of the cultural sort of topics of choice being Black Lives Matter and representation is huge in America. Could you comment a little bit about, on your thoughts on who gets to tell stories in the USA and how USA's history plays into those who have opportunities, and how you might see that changing given the last 12 to 18 months of discussion about that?
Well, I mean, I've always been like a proponent of like making things more equitable and just. I mean, you see that in the actions I've done. You've seen that in the creation of the Immigrant Arts Coalition. I've done that face to face with the last, not president, but his administration. So it's like the stories that are worth telling need to be told. And whatever background you're from, if that is authentic and that resonates, there should be no barrier that's still standing in your way. And I know there is, and it's really unfortunate and disappointing. And one of the things I'm actually doing is I have another one of my contributing things is I have a bi-weekly column at Newsbreak that talks more about social justice and how do we get there and what stories are being told. I think the country is kind of a place where it needs to listen, right? I think particularly, well, first of all, we've seen this in the world at large, right? Over the last year, more so visibly because of obviously the advent of social media and streaming. And it's kind of like undeniable what you're seeing now is the truth that's been masked or not spoken about or oppressed for so long. So I think that the stories that need to be told are still the stories that need to be told. I just think that in general, there needs to be a little more of a commitment to working cohesively and collectively with stakeholders to get those stories told across different platforms, across different spectrums, and kind of having the discussions that I think are happening, but I hope will continue on how and why this is relevant and how we can tell this in a way that people are hearing and not just listening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does the Immigrant Arts Coalition do? Like what does, explain that to me.
Sure. So back in the day when I was more involved, so I was the founder. I've kind of stepped away a little bit since then, but it kind of helped. The first thing is it helped unite kind of all these different immigrant arts organizations, first within New York City, which had so many to begin with, right? But then as kind of a national bridge to that. Within that, it lended support, whether it was helping people achieve visas, whether it was helping tell stories of inclusivity, whether it was about showing the strengths and collaborations of differences and cultures, whether we were talking with state, city, national about immigration policies. It kind of became a champion kind of for the underrepresented immigrant artist. And as many immigrant artists know, it's incredibly hard to get the work visa here if you're an artist. You're either, you've got 3 Academy Awards, right? So that's easy, or you go through so many hoops, and it's like it's kind of ridiculous, and there's not enough parity with that, and a lot of those systems needed to be reworked. So we advocated a lot for that. We lobbied a lot for that. We worked with individual artists. We worked with artist groups with a collaborative sense. We also did things like we had an international festival in New York, right? We did that 2 years in a row to celebrate the diversity and heritage of really the country. But yeah, that was an important thing for me because I feel like this country was founded on that, right? Give us, you're tired, you're poor, etc., right? Like, come on, like we are a country of immigrants, like, and of course, obviously, the Native Americans who were here way before we were, but it's just about that respect and like understanding that everyone here deserves to be here if they want to be here. And if they want to pursue like their art here, why shouldn't we help them? I've always been, if you haven't guessed already, I've always been a fan of more voices to the table, make for a better project. And I feel like more voices to the community tell a better story and a greater story of inclusion. So that was a big thing for me with the Immigrant Arts Coalition.
No, it's amazing. It's like you said, the more diversity in terms of who has those stories. I mean, what lids have not been opened if you're excluding people from telling those stories, and how fascinating if you can bring a lot of people to the table. I think it's interesting because I think America, a lot of media comes out of America. There's a lot. If I could say it, America's quite loud in promoting what the things going on with the world in their sense, whereas other countries, there's a lot of inequities all around the world. So it's with America talking about it and speaking about it and bringing it up, I think it has ricocheted awareness globally, right? So I think, in a sense, USA plays quite an important role in demonstrating culturally where we should be heading, right? And do you feel the same?
I do, but I think ultimately it comes down. Yes, we should be leading together, but I think it starts like at the very micro level. It's like, what changes individually are you going to do? And once you figure that out, you find a group that you can work together with that makes sense within those changes that authentically work for you, right? And then it's just about building those voices. I don't know if it's necessarily the country to lead, right? And of course that becomes a federal kind of thing, and that's far above my pay grade, right? But it's really about us as individuals taking the action, you know, and not relying on groups or government to kind of do that, because ultimately change is going to occur at an individual and personal level. I mean, it's the same thing with the relationship building for anything, right? I have to get to know who I'm working with. I just had, previous to this, I had a wonderful 30-minute conversation with my development manager, right? And that's an important thing. Now, we did talk about some important kind of future planning things, but it's important to just take the time to get to know people, because that's the way you're going to be able to exact change, is understanding who you are, where you are, who you're interacting with, and what the impact of that ultimately is, right? So that's change management. And I think you've got to be willing to, what's been the popular phrase, right, is do the work. You've got to be willing to do that yourself and hold yourself accountable to it. And then others will follow by example.
I love that, because I think it can be quite overwhelming when you're looking at it from a country or global scale where the work has to be done. Start with your community, change your periphery, right? Everyone around you by your leadership. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful philosophy. Thank you, Chris. That's really lovely. Next 12 months for you and Pioneer Theatre Company. Anything we should know about? What's the plan coming out of the pandemic, where you said you may be offline, you were talking about maybe coming back in September?
Yeah. So that's the plan for now, right? If the world goes in a different direction, we're going to be we'll be least of all part of that, right? So it's like, but right now we're planning, yes, we're going to be back in September. We just announced our season. We announced a mystery show that we haven't announced yet, but we'll talk about that. And our first two shows, we want to play it very safe. The September and October shows will be playing at half capacity. Of course, all social distancing measures will be in place throughout this until we hear otherwise from CDC, from the state, and from the university. But we are looking forward to getting back to a season where it's your ticket to feel ... good. Because goodness, we all need that right now.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate spending an hour with us at Theatre Art Life. And I really wish the best for Pioneer Theatre Company, yourself and your family and your little bub. It's hopefully asleep right now.
Thank you so much. One could only hope, but I just want to thank you on behalf of us, the staff, the board, and of course my wonderful partner, Karen. It's been such a pleasure, Anna. Thank you.
Wonderful. We'll be in touch, and thank you everyone for tuning in today, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Bye for now.